How's everybody doing so far? End of the day? Man, you guys are crushing it. Wow. I mean, okay. Can we all just take a moment? Let's just stand up. All right, I need everyone to just do like a big sunrise. Yep, reach way up. Sunset. Yep, okay. Roll the shoulders back. Okay, yeah, you can take a seat. Awesome. I won't do a full yoga session, but I know it's the last session of the day, so I want to make sure we're prepared. So guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to connect in a couple ways because what I do at Hope Reins is teaching all of our mentors and our program specialists who work directly with our kids. I teach them the mentorship and the discipleship side, right? So, and then I connect them to one of our horsemanship instructors to learn the horsemanship side. So I want to connect with you guys in a couple ways before we get started with this presentation. One, I want to connect by you guys knowing a little bit about me, right? Because I often say it's kind of hard to trust what we don't know, right? So my name is Ashlee. I have the privilege of being the program staff manager at Hope Reins. And what that means, guys, is I have the honor and the privilege of being able to equip and train everyone who comes to Hope Reins who works directly with our families. So if they are a volunteer or if they are on our staff, I get the honor and the privilege of walking alongside them to be trained and equipped in what we do. A couple of things about me. I'm not going to tell you the boring things like what I did or what I studied or things like that. You guys don't care about that. A couple of things that you do want to know, though, just so you can know a little bit about me, we can build some trust. One, is anybody in here a thrill seeker? Call yourself an adrenaline junkie. Did anybody say that? Okay. Okay, same. One of the things that I like to share about myself is that I jumped out of a plane at 13,500 feet. Of course, with a parachute and a skydiving expert. Secondly, what you should know about me is that I will burst out into song at random moments. As I am walking around the ranch, you will often hear me singing worship songs or maybe other songs that have come on the radio. Everyone, I think, needs a soundtrack to their own life. And thirdly, guys, I have a philosophy about food. And that philosophy is that food is a vehicle to get sauce into my mouth. Right? Sauce is one of my favorite things. Whether it is Chick-fil-A sauce, whether it is sriracha sauce, no matter what it is, I would rather have food with sauce on it. So that's just a couple of things about me that I think that you guys should know. But guys, even more importantly than that, I want to connect on a spiritual level. So if you would, let's pray together before we jump into this. Jesus, you are so, so good to us. And we are so thankful to be at this place, God, at Wings of Hope Ranch, where we have the opportunity to come together as a community that is focused on similar ministry, God. This is not our ministry, this is your ministry. And we have the privilege and the opportunity to be a part of that, to see the kingdom work that you are already doing in the lives of these kids and these families, and to be able to come alongside of that, Jesus. And so, God, I pray for every single person that's in this room. I pray for every single person that is in other breakout sessions right now, that as we come to this place, just like Stephanie said on the very first night of the main clinic, God, that as we come to this place, that you would be central, that you would be our focus, and that we would leave this place measuring everything against your word and against the missions that you have given us, and following in step with that. So God, we step out in faith, knowing that you have the power to heal, the power to redeem and to restore. And we love you so, so much. We pray all of these things in the precious and holy name of Jesus. Amen. So, guys, I want to start by really starting at the beginning, right? As I focus on mentorship and discipleship, right? We want to start with, why does this conversation matter, right? I'm sure all of you in this room are aware of why it matters, right? Because all of us are likely working with populations in some form. Many of us kids, some of us in other realms, but all of us are working with populations that have somehow experienced trauma or life crisis. So you guys have probably seen the news headlines, right? Trauma affects everything about a child's development, right? We often say at Hope Reins that trauma affects the body, words, and emotions of a child, right? And you can extrapolate this to other populations as well. I want to read this directly because I think this is such a good quote. This was actually a secular psychologist, but man, he hit it home when he said this. Charles Figley, who is a professor of psychology, family therapy, and mental health, and also the Traumatology Institute director at FSU, puts it this way: trauma has a spiritual dimension. The suffering it causes ranges from physical to existential pain.
I hear her more than you.
Okay, I will speak up some. Is that great? Okay. Charles Figley says this: trauma has a spiritual dimension. The suffering it causes ranges from physical to existential pain. It can disrupt assumptions of morality, values, principles, identity, beliefs, ideals, religion, meaning, and purpose. Trauma attacks the soul. And I think that's such a poignant statement coming from a secular psychologist, right? Because what they're realizing is trauma is holistic in its effect of children. We've seen the rise of the mental health crisis of our kids, even over the last few years, right? As we have entered and then are coming out of a pandemic, right? One thing that we often hear people say, I'm sure you guys have heard the old adage, kids are so resilient, right? Who's heard that before? Come on in. Kids are so resilient, right? Well, that's true when they've fallen and scraped their knee, right? They might whine for a little while, get up, hug somebody that they care, and then they're off to the next thing that they're playing with. But trauma has a different effect on a child, right? We know here that when trauma happens in the life of a child, whether it's an acute case of trauma or whether it's chronic trauma, right, that is something that slowly kind of eats away at their ability to be resilient. So what do we mean when we say resilient? How would you guys define resilient, if you've heard that word before? Throw out some things that you think when you think of the word to be resilient. Adapt.
Ability to carry on in spite of trauma.
Yeah, the ability to carry on in spite of trauma. That's great.
Getting back to feeling normal.
Getting back to feeling normal.
Not easily defeated.
Not easily defeated. That's right. Yeah, we often say at Hope Reins that it is the ability to bounce back, or the ability to return to being healthy and hopeful after crisis or trauma has occurred. So a conglomeration of what you guys said, right? And so how do we do that then, right? How do kids even begin to understand what it looks like to build back in resiliency after they have experienced some sort of trauma or life crisis? How many of you have interacted with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the ACEs study? Okay, got a few hands, right? So they call it ACEs for short. This was a landmark study that was done in the late 1990s that really was kind of a landmark study of childhood traumatic research, right? What they did is they took 17,000 participants and they took about 10 categories of what they would consider an adverse childhood experience. So those were things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical, emotional neglect, parent incarceration, substance abuse within the home, parent divorce, right? They took about 8 to 10 of these categories and they marked each participant with how many of these ACEs have they experienced so far in life, right? And then what they did is they found, probably unsurprisingly to most of you, they found that there was a strong positive correlation with as the number of ACEs that someone had experienced in their childhood went up, so did the likelihood of developing certain emotional and mental disorders and issues later in life, right? So extreme depression, debilitating anxiety, right? What was a little more surprising to them at that time, which has now been researched even more, is that also, there was a strong positive correlation with as the number of ACEs went up, so did the likelihood of even developing other physical health effects later in life, right? So even things like developing GI tract issues from being nervous all the time, right? Or higher likelihood of heart disease, right? Things like that. And so this kind of caused them to say, wait, hold the phone, right? Like, childhood trauma is affecting the whole development of a child, right? It's affecting their body, their words, and their emotions, right? So we need to find ways to step in, right, after this has occurred. So these are, I just want you to take in some of these numbers. This is the slide that probably is going to have the most words of any of them on there. Take in some of these numbers. These are some of the different crises that bring kids to us at Hope Reins. I'm sure that some of you guys have experienced some of the same exact things. And this was a couple of years ago that this particular graphic was developed, so I can tell you that even some of these numbers have risen in the amount of time that we have continued to see kids come post-pandemic. Right, so we see things like struggling with anxiety and depression, 59% experiencing loss or grief, right? Extreme loss. And we even see the effects of different traumas, right? Over 14% having contemplated or attempted suicide, right? So again, if this is the why it matters, then what do we do? What do we do about that? So there was another study that was done by a group at Harvard called the Resiliency study. Has anyone interacted with this study at all? Okay, cool. So they found that in order for kids to be resilient, to even start to learn what it looks like to be resilient, that there were 4 main things that kids needed. And we broke them down at Hope Reins for our basic training. We kind of put them in layman's terms, but I'll tell you what the study actually said as well. So the first thing that we say, in order to be resilient, to even start building back in skills of resiliency, the first thing that we say is that kids need a trusted friend, right? So what the study actually said was kids need one consistent, stable adult relationship in their life that cares for them, that knows them, and that is cheering them on, right? Sometimes we say kids need a hero, right? And I always tell mentors, guys, ultimately, we're not the hero, right? But we get to be the stand-in to point them to the true hero, which is Jesus. The second thing is that kids need a refuge or a safe place, right? So we tried to create this in 2 ways at Hope Reins. One, we wanted them to feel like they had a physical refuge, right? So when they step onto the ranch, we wanted it to feel like a safe, beautiful, functional place, right? But secondly, we wanted them to have an emotional refuge, right? With the person that they're paired with. So that's why it was really important for us to create a process of discernment and training for our mentors to actually be equipped to meet kids who have experienced trauma right where they are, right? We want them to be able to meet them where they are. And this is really important because if we look at scripture, right, this even connects to how many times do you guys see the word refuge in scripture, right? Like, who can name for me right now different references of refuge, or just like call out different scriptures? Psalm 62, yeah. Yeah, Psalm 46:1, right? The Lord is our refuge, a helper who is always found in times of trouble, right? So we want them to have, what the study actually said for refuge is that kids need a sense of perceived control over their environment before they can master the skills of resiliency, right? A sense of perceived control. So we need to give them that place to be able to have that so that they can begin to learn. Because as Elizabeth was telling us, if you were in the previous breakout session, is that if we're in an environment where we're hypervigilant, just like horses, right? Like we can't even begin to come down and learn. Until a kid feels safe, they're going to be constantly on alert for danger, right? Thirdly, they found that kids need a voice. Right? So what they actually said is children who develop strong executive function and self-regulation skills, these skills enable them to manage their own behavior and emotions and develop and execute adaptive strategies to cope effectively with difficult circumstances, right? So they're not able to find ways to cope until they know who they are, right? This is huge about identity, right? And we talk about this all the time with our mentors. Identity is so huge for all of us, right? But what does our voice, where does that come from, right? It comes from our identity. So we don't know what our voice wants to say. I tell our mentors, our kids don't know what their voice wants to say until they know who they are. So we want to give them a place in sessions to figure out who they are, right? Who they are past their trauma. So what are their likes? What are their dislikes? What are their passions? What makes them light up? What are the things that they're good at? What are the things they feel like they're not good at, right? We want them to be able to figure out those things in a safe environment and to know that their voice matters, right? This is really important in making sure that they have a clear perception of their identity so that they know that their voice matters. And fourthly, the resiliency study found that kids need a purpose. This is really important, and they said when they talk about purpose, what they mean is they need the supportive context of affirming faith or cultural traditions. Children who are solidly grounded within such traditions are more likely to respond effectively when challenged by a major stressor or a severely disruptive experience, right? So faith, hope, and cultural traditions, right? This is really important for us at Hope Reins because we know ultimately their overall purpose is to be image bearers of God, right? That's what we're all here to do. But that can be a little bit abstract for kids, right? Who have never experienced, what does it mean to bear someone's image, right? Like, who is this God? So as we are developing a framework for that, we also want to help our kids understand their specific purpose, right? All of us have an innate desire to know that we have something to give back to the world, right? So do our kids. And so we want them to develop a clear understanding of what are you passionate about? What are you good at, right? What are things that really wake you up and drive you? What do you find joy in? What is your purpose, right? So if these are the 4 things that the resiliency study found that kids need to even begin to step into a space of learning what it looks like to be resilient, right? Then what do we do, right? So at Hope Reins, we pair kids in crisis with rescued horses and mentors to find hope and healing, right? So the beginning of our program, we have 1 kid, we have 1 horse, and we have 1 mentor, right? And if you want to talk about the rest of our pathway, I'm very passionate about it, so I would love to talk about how the rest of our pathway goes. But this is how we start. We start a kid with a horse and a mentor, and we want them to be able to find that place where they can bridge a gap of trust, and that they can have a trusted friend. They can be in a place that feels like a refuge. They can begin to understand what their voice is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, right? And they can begin to develop what is their purpose in life, right? So, I want to ask you guys, before we jump into Hope Reins resiliency skills, which if you have been to Elizabeth's, you already got a sneak peek of what those are. We'll go into them in more depth from the program side, but I want to ask you guys, what are some of the things that you think horses can teach kids in trauma, or really anyone in trauma? Just shout them out. What are some different things that you think horses can teach? Connection. Yeah. Boundaries. Great one. Regulation. Trust. What else, guys? What have horses taught you? You're not alone. That's great. Patience. Yeah. When they do what you want them to do and when they don't do what you want them to do. Peace.
Leadership.
What's that?
Leadership.
Leadership. That's great. I've already heard, I think, 3/4 of the ones we're going to share with you. So yeah, guys, horses can teach us an incredible amount, but I want to share with you guys the 4 things that are core to our program at Hope Reins. And we have building blocks to each of our skills. If you want to know more about each of the building blocks and how they play in, definitely come and see me afterwards. I'd love to share that with you. But I'll share with you with the first one what that looks like, just so you can understand how we build upon it. But the first one I heard was trust, right? Trust is a core key beginning piece for our kids to learn, right? And for each of our skills at Hope Reins, we have what we call an internal belief statement. And what that means is this is the thing that a kid has to inherently believe about themselves before they can even begin to really fully develop that skill, right? So for trust, the internal belief statement that we have tied to that is a kid must believe I am safe, right? I am safe, right? Because if I don't feel safe, if I'm hypervigilant, if I'm constantly on alert for danger, then I'm not even going to know how to begin to settle enough to focus on you and trust you, right? I won't even know what that looks like. So our building blocks to this, I said I would share kind of what that looked like with the first development skill that we have. So with trust, we break each of our resiliency skills down into 4 components at Hope Reins. And the reason why we do this is really for a couple of different reasons. One is that it gives our mentors more to notice and more to talk about in order to parse out that skill so that a kid can fully understand it. Because when I just say the word, hey, let's learn about trust, right? Doesn't that feel pretty vague to you guys? Like you're like, well, okay, what about trust are we learning about, right? But if we break it down into smaller components, then when I'm sitting across from a child in a session, or I'm grooming a horse with a child, or I'm beginning the steps of helping a child learn what it looks like to actually get on a horse, right? I can start to notice and be aware of what are the places about trust that they haven't quite learned yet, right? So for trust, our 4 building blocks are first, a kid has to feel safe, right? Safety. Safety is the first building block to trust. The second is reliability, right? A kid has to believe that you are going to be reliable before they're willing to trust you. The third is authenticity, right? A kid has to believe that you are authentically being yourself and they can authentically be themselves before they're willing to trust you. And finally, love, right? A kid has to feel loved and believed in, right? Loved for who they are, not for what they do, for what they bring, but simply for who they are, just like God does for us, right? And they have to feel loved before they're going to be willing to trust you. So that's how we break it down. And when you have those broken down components with your resiliency skills, then what you can do is as you're in a session, you can take time to look at a kid and think, what part of trust do I need to work on with this kid in this session, right? Like, oh, they don't even feel safe, right? They don't even feel like they have a space to come down from all of the energy that they're experiencing. Or, oh, they don't feel like they can authentically be themselves, right? They feel like they have to put on the front. They feel like they have to, mask who they are, right? So let's work on that. Let's find a skill for that. Let's find a tool for that, right? So what do horses teach us about trust, right? Because that was the subtitle of this presentation. Well, one, horses are prey animals, right? So their primary concern is safety, just like that initial component of trust. And a lot of our kids are actually like pretty surprised to find out that horses are prey animals because they're just big to them. So they're like, wow, I didn't know that, right? They don't realize that we're actually predators coming into their space. So with that comes that horses require high levels of trust and trustworthiness, right? Like horses, it is natural for a horse to mistrust humans, right? We are the opposite end of the food chain as them. So it is natural that they mistrust us. But what we get to teach our kids is that it's up to us to bridge the gap to the horses, right? And so one of the things that I like to share with our mentors is that as we are in relationship with horses with our kids, everything that we teach our kids to do with our horses is supposed to be to get their mental wheels spinning of how can I do this in human relationships too, right? How can I bridge the gap to another human? How can I know if another human is trustworthy for me, right? Not just immediately trust them with all of myself or hold them away at like a 40-foot pole, right? And in this, we see a picture of the gospel, right? We see with trust that God chose to pursue us at like radically at great cost to himself, right? He chose to pursue us even when we didn't trust him. And so we can share that with our kids. We can share with them like what it looks like to pursue a relationship with a horse, even when they're not sure of us. And man, I'm sure that some of you have experienced what it is like when a kid first has that moment where they see that the horse has connected with them, or where they see that the horse has built a little bit of trust with them, and it's so empowering, right? So empowering to them. They're like, oh, they trusted me. They came with me, right? It's so empowering to see that. I'm sure that even some of you have felt that. I know that I have before. The second resiliency skill that we talk about at Hope Reins is boundaries. I know I heard someone say that. Boundaries are huge for kids that have experienced trauma, right? The internal belief statement here is I matter, right? This is really important because if a kid does not internally believe I matter, then they won't believe that they have the right to their own boundaries, right? I have to believe that who I am and my space matters before I'm willing to be able to clearly set my own boundaries, right? I have to have courage to know that I can speak up when something has happened. So how do horses teach us boundaries? I would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts. How has a horse taught you boundaries before? Yeah.
So kind of just like people, everyone has their own bubble and personal space.
Yeah.
And I apparently sometimes do not pay attention to personal space because we have one horse that will let you know that you are in his space by biting you. But just with his like lips, he doesn't like break skin and like he just gives you a hello.
He's like, I'm here. Yeah.
So we were just walking. I wasn't pulling on it or nothing. It was a nice walk. So I know I wasn't like yanking on him or anything like that, but I was too close. So he turned his head and literally bit my whole boob. And so in that day, I very much so learned his boundary of a bubble.
Yeah.
And that I was in it.
Yeah, that's great. Anything else? How has a horse taught you boundaries? Well, guys, one thing that I always like to share with our mentors, whether they've been around horses or not, is when your partner is over 1,000 pounds, they will teach you how to set your personal space real quick, as you mentioned, right? Because we can't really power a horse, right, to our own will. Like they're a lot larger than us, and if we don't maintain and set our lane, then they will be the winner every time of that space, right? So first, we have to recognize that we are worthy of being respected and of having our own lane, right? So sometimes we will often tell our kids to set their care lane. That's how we'll describe it. As they're learning how to lead a horse, we'll say, this is your lane, and this is the horse's lane. And in order to care for each other well, we're gonna hold our own lane, right? And that way, when they're leading, if the horse sees grass and starts to cut in front of them, we teach them, oh no, I can respectfully and clearly say, stay in your lane, right? I don't have to power the horse, right? I don't have to try to man or woman handle it. I can simply say, no, stay, this is your lane, stay in your lane, right? And that is also super empowering to our kids when they realize, I just got an over 1,000 pound animal to stay in their lane. How do I do this with humans, right?
How do you practically display that for the child to tell the horse to stay in their own lane? What does that look like?
Like when they're coming into their lane?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the example of like the cutting across their lane, right, to go to grass, we just teach them to first like pull up, right, on the rope, and then to clearly just kind of, they'll lay their hand on the side of their face and just tell them to go back to their lane, right? So it's no like pushing of the horse, no like pulling them or jerking them, right? We just clearly tell them, hey, as you're walking, right, we want to answer the question as soon as possible, right? So if you see the horse ask the question about grass, then we can go ahead and tell them like, hey, stay in your lane, right? So that also, we'll get to our next point as well, but that also teaches the kid, hey, let's be insightful listeners of as soon as the horse starts asking the question, right? So that I don't have to have that power move of, you already crossed my boundaries and now I'm going to shove you back into your lane, right? Like we teach them like, hey, how do we notice when our boundary is about to be crossed, right? Instead of just like when it's already been obliterated, right? Equally important, and I know Elizabeth mentioned this, is our willingness to listen to and respect the boundaries of the horse, right? So as we're teaching kids what it looks like to respect the boundaries of our horse, it also teaches them what it looks like to respect the boundaries of another human, right? We often know that trauma begets trauma, right? Sometimes hurt people. And we want to teach our kids what it looks like for our boundaries to be honored so that then they can also step into a space where they know clearly what it looks like for other people's boundaries to be honored as well, right? So we teach our kids even in really simple ways, right? Like when I touch a horse, was that horse okay with it? Let's notice. Let's notice what feedback the horse gives us with its language as to whether that spot was okay or that type of activity was okay, right? Because we want to know how can I honor that horse's and respect their boundaries as well, right? And finally, one thing that I love to mention from Scripture, right, is we see boundaries mentioned in Scripture in many ways. One, if you think about from Proverbs, right, Proverbs 4 says, guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life, right? So that guarding, there's a sense of, I need to have boundaries around what I'm going to let into my heart and into my space. Another example of how we see boundaries is let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than this is from the evil one, right? So I need to have clear boundaries with what I'm going to say yes to and what I'm going to say no to, right? The next thing that we talk about at Hope Reins when we talk about our 4 resiliency skills is communication. This one is huge and really important for our kids to be able to understand how do I communicate clearly what I want and what I need from a relationship and what I don't want, right? What is not respectful to me. So the internal belief statement that we have tied to communication is I am not alone, right? I am not alone. Why do you think that this is the internal belief statement? What is it about I am not alone that you feel like would tie to communication? Anyone have an idea?
Well, it's the conduit of connection.
Yeah.
Without communication, you can't really connect.
Right. And if you're alone, you don't really have anyone to communicate with, right? If I believe that I am inherently and utterly alone, right? Not even just physically, right? But if I believe that I am alone in my situation, if I believe I am alone in my pain, if I believe, even if you're right there in front of me, that I am alone in understanding, right? That there's no bridge from me to you, right? Then I'm going to feel like I don't have anyone to communicate effectively with, right? So, how do horses teach our kids communication? Well, in interpersonal studies, do you guys know what percentage that most interpersonal studies would say is nonverbal for us? So not with our words. 75? Good thought? Yeah.
Really high.
Any other guess? 80? Yeah. Most interpersonal studies would put it at around 90%. 90% of what we say is not with our words, right? Around 60% of what we say is with our hand gestures, our body language, right? Like if I was doing this breakout session with you guys, but I was like this, that communicates something very different, right? Than if I was like this, right? So it's with my gestures, it's with my eye contact, it's with like whether I'm an open posture or whether I'm a closed posture, right? It's with so many parts of my body, right? The other 30% of that 90% is what is going on with my vocalization, right? So it's my pitch, it's my rate, it's if I didn't have to be louder than this other breakout session, then maybe at times I could get quiet to draw you in, right? Maybe at times you pause, right? To create some sort of effect. So it's the vocalization of what's going on. The other 10% is what I actually say with my words. Did you have a question?
Now, I realize in handling with children, if you really want them to pay attention and you whisper to them, they have to listen harder.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, actually, a lot of interpersonal relationship with kids say that like getting louder usually doesn't help because then they'll get louder. But actually, if you get quieter, then they're drawn in, right? And then you don't have to raise the energy up, right? So, if around 90% of what we say is not with our words, this might be a slightly easier one. Somebody tell me how much of horses' communication is verbal. That's right. 100% of what horses usually say is some sort of nonverbal cue, right? Sure, they give different vocalizations and sounds, right? But in relation to what we say, right, they're not speaking English to us. They're not speaking a verbal language that we can understand. So when words are not an option, we have to look beyond them to the messages that we're sending with our body, right? And that is really important for kids who have experienced trauma because a lot of times trauma, one of the responses that kids can have is to dissociate, right? So to metaphorically leave their body. In a moment of trauma, when kids have experienced that, especially if it's something like an intense abuse situation, right? In the moment of trauma, they will metaphorically leave their body in order to feel less pain. So then anytime they are emotionally activated after that, even if they're not in danger, that same response will happen. They'll dissociate, right? So we like to help our kids understand, how do I stay in my body and learn what I'm communicating to my horse, right? How do I know when I'm like all over the place and the lead line is here and the horse is like, what are you doing, right? And we help our kids to look at, what am I doing with my body, right? And if I'm communicating unclearly to a horse, then what am I communicating to other people, right? What is my body communicating to another human? Horses teach us to become insightful listeners and communication of feel, right? So as Elizabeth was talking about, how do I achieve what I want with the smallest ask, right? We teach our kids that you can get clearer and you can get louder without your emotions becoming negative, right? You don't have to be angry to get clearer, which many of our kids, that's what they've seen. They've seen when someone decides that they want to get clearer with you, they get angry, right? Or they get loud or they get abusive with their language. So we teach them like, hey, you don't have to do that. One of the passages in Scripture that I love the most that I think is critical to communication is James 1:19, right? Which says, "My dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry," right? Communication, a large portion of it is about how well do I listen, right? How well do I listen? And then at what moment is it appropriate and right for me to speak, right? Sorry, I'm fighting the rain, I'm fighting the other breakout session. That's all right. But, woo, I'm going to communicate. Yes.
Start singing if you need to.
Yeah, I might break out in song. Don't worry about it. And finally, guys, our last resiliency skill at Hope Reins is leadership, right? So with this one, our internal belief statement is I have purpose, right? I have purpose. Yes. So with this one, guys, why do you think that we have, what is important about purpose for leaders? Yeah. In order to understand leadership, why does purpose matter?
It steers their ship, tells them where their feet are headed.
Yeah.
It tells them what they need to do.
Yeah, she said it steers their ship, tells them where their feet are headed. What else?
To feel worth.
What's that?
To feel worth.
To feel worth. I like that. Anything else?
I just think if they're not grounded in a purpose, a specific purpose, hopefully through the art of Christ, they are very vulnerable to fall for anything.
Yeah. If they're not grounded in purpose, she said, then they're very vulnerable to fall for anything. Isn't there like an old country song that's like, you've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything? Okay, yeah. Maybe not old. Sorry, that's not it. So guys, what do horses teach us about leadership? A whole lot, right? Every horse wants a good leader, right? Even when you look within herd dynamics, they all have a leader. And we always tell our kids, like, that is not because that horse is the biggest bully, right? Or because they're always bossy. But it is because in a moment of danger, every other horse is going to look to that horse for what to do, right? That's the horse that they're looking for how are you going to react so that I know how I need to react, right? So what defines a good leader to a horse, right? One thing that we tell our kids is it's not the way we look, not the way we dress, right? It's not how forceful or charismatic I am, right? A good leader to a horse is a leader that leads in such a way that I can be a soft, willing follower, right? A soft, willing follower. So let me ask you guys a question. Is that the type of leadership that you would want? Yeah? Yeah. You know, when we talk about humans, right, we know that kids or adults, right, we want a leader that provides a space for me to want to follow, right? Not the one that drags me along, right? Or the one that forces me to do something that I don't want to do. But I want a leader that provides a space and a vision for me to say, I want to follow that, right? Horses want the same thing. So one of the things that we tell our kids is that as we seek to understand a horse's needs, as we seek to understand the horse's fears and their motivations, we begin to earn the right to influence them, right? We begin to earn the right to influence what they do, right? And finally, I think that, right, one of the best examples of leadership that we see anywhere is in the earthly ministry of Jesus, right? Is in the earthly ministry of Jesus, right? Jesus, he is someone who approaches us in that same way as someone who wants us to be a soft, willing follower, right? We see in Mark chapter 10, where Jesus says of himself, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, right? So he had this model of servant leadership that came to stoop low, right? That came to wash feet, right? Instead of to be charismatic and forceful and powerful. He chose, when he spoke of his own heart, right? In Matthew 11, Jesus chose to say of himself that I am gentle and lowly, right? That he's accessible to us. So how do we teach our kids what it looks like to be a leader to a horse that is gentle and accessible to their needs, right? So, let's get practical with this, right? So guys, with the last few minutes, I want you guys to be able to look at what it looks like to build a tool from a skill, right? So at Hope Reins, we have what we call a session skills toolbox, and we have actually developed tools that help us to talk through these different skills that I just gave you in sessions, right? So I'm going to give you an example of what our tools look like, and then I want you guys to have a few minutes to just create your own tool. And it doesn't have to be like a tool that you're going to take back and use with all of your kids. It can just be an example tool, and it can even be something that you've learned earlier today. Sometimes we say the best ideas are ideas that you've taken from somebody else, right? So if you want to kind of create in this format a tool that has already been shown today, that's totally cool. I just want you to have the opportunity to be able to practice what it looks like to develop a tool. So let me show you the way that we do this at Hope Reins as we are equipping our mentors. One, you need to know what your focus skill is, right? So for us, we look at everything that we create is based on our 4 skills. So what is your focus skill? It doesn't have to be trust, boundaries, communication, or leadership. You can have other focus skills, but you need to define for your program what are your focus skills that you want your kids to engage in, right? As you are developing what it looks like to have a session with a kid, you want to be able to have skills that you can actually focus on, right? So that you can have something to teach to your kids. So with the focus skill, you want to be able to answer 2 things, right? One, you want to answer, what am I trying to teach, right? And I always encourage mentors, as we have developed our own toolbox, I always encourage them, focus on one skill, right? A tool can teach more than one skill. The tool that I'm about to show you from our toolbox definitely teaches more than one skill, but we have it underneath one skill, because if you try to teach all 4 skills with one tool at one time, then the kid might leave with, I'm not really sure what I got from that, right? So we want to be really clear with defining one skill. And then you can come back to that tool later and teach it with another lens, right? But focus on one skill as you're creating it. And then if you have a building block to that skill, use that building block to define it. So for us with trust, like I said, we will often, on our toolbox, we'll say, hey, this is a trust tool, and it is under our building block of safety, right? So feel free to do that as well. The second thing that you're going to want to do for your tool is you're going to want to have a summary, right? So a summary is 1 to 3 sentences at the top of your tool, 1 to 3 sentences. And in those 1 to 3 sentences, you want to do 2 things. You want to tell the goal of your tool so that when one of your mentors looks at that tool, they can understand what the goal of that tool is. And then you want to briefly describe how that tool is done, right? You're going to get into the facilitation later, but you want to briefly describe how is this tool actually done, because if your guys' sessions are anything like ours, mentors may have 10 to 15 minutes before the session actually starts to be able to look at your toolbox and determine if that's a tool they want to use in the session that they're about to do, right? They don't have an hour and a half to plan it out unless they kind of take their toolbox home. So you want to be able to briefly define for them in that summary, what is the goal of this tool, and briefly, how do you do it? So they know, am I even equipped to be able to do this tool, right? The next thing that you want to do is define any spaces or supplies that are needed for your tool. So get really practical. I remember one of my English teachers in high school, whenever I was writing a paper, she said that you want to write this paper as if you're writing it for alien eyes, right? So when you're building a tool for your mentors, build it with as much detail as possible, right? Because you want them to feel like I can jump in, grab this tool, and know how to use it or modify it for my session, right? You want to equip your mentors as best as possible. So does location matter, right? Does it need to be in an arena, right? Does it need to be in a grassy area? Does it need to be under a shelter? Or can it be anywhere on my ranch or on our property? What is needed to accomplish this tool, right? So do I need a horse? Do I need a training stick? Do I need arts and crafts, right? As we've seen in other tools, what do I need in order to do this tool? And then finally, let me show you this first, how we laid this out. So this is one of our tools. So this is one of our horsemanship tools. You can see that it is under boundaries, and our subcomponent is self-awareness. And this is a horsemanship tool that we call the yo-yo game. So you can see our summary is one sentence. Utilize a simple horsemanship activity to create a boundary between the session child and a horse to help restore their self-awareness, right? The yo-yo game can teach multiple other things. It can teach leadership very well. But for this one, we wanted it to teach boundaries. How do I create a boundary between my horse and my child? And then how do I invite them back in? So our location we chose is either Cameron's, which is our covered arena, or our outdoor arena. Supplies needed is you need a horse, and you need a halter and a lead rope. And then the last thing that you want to do is you want to equip your mentors with instructions and facilitation points for their tool, right? So the 3 things that you want to give your mentors is they're going to ask, what do I ask my kid, right? What questions do I ask my kid to get them started in understanding boundaries and self-awareness? I'll show you an example of that. The next thing you want to give them is, what do I say, right? Again, alien eyes, right? We want to equip our mentors with, sometimes they're like, I don't even know how to start talking about self-awareness and boundaries and horses and trauma, right? So what do I say to get me started, right? And then the conversation can develop as they're with their kid, but how do I start it? And then what do I do, right? So they need to actually know how to do the activity that you're telling them to do. So with ours, this is not the entire tool. This is just part of it. But you can see examples of what we did as we explain the yo-yo game. So we tell our mentors, hey, start by asking them, what is a boundary? Why is it important to have boundaries, right? Start that conversation about boundaries with them. See what your kid offers. And then say something like, we all have a thing around us called a boundary, right? You can't see it, but it's there. It's kind of like an invisible force field. It's there to protect each of us from others and keep us comfortable and safe. You're completely in charge of that force field. You can decide when it goes up and when it comes down. And then you want to actually start helping them understand how to facilitate the tool. So for the yo-yo game, we halter our horse, we spend time finding connection, and then we demonstrate with them the yo-yo game. And the yo-yo game is just simply getting a horse to back away from you and then inviting them back in, right? So I'm not going to demonstrate the tool itself for you, but I just want you to see how we write a tool for our mentors. So I want you guys to have a few minutes to actually be able to practice writing a tool for your mentors. So let's start time to get building. So on the last sheet, what I want you guys to do is I want you to take about 5 minutes, and I want you to create a tool for yourself. Any focus skill that you want, right? And I just want you to practice writing a summary that actually can make sense to your mentor, writing the location or the supplies that you feel like you would need for that tool, and then giving some facilitation and instruction points for it. And then I'm going to ask a couple of people if they'd be willing to share at the end what their tool looked like. So just take a couple minutes. I want you guys to create your own tool.
And we know we didn't have enough notes pages for everybody, so if you need to kind of look off somebody else's sheet, that would be great. And we also mixed in some of our other section by accident, so help each other out. Let people look at the sheet if you can.
Yeah, I know. I was like, man, I should have printed more. Now guys, don't forget with instructions and facilitation, remember, what do I ask? What do I say? What do I do? We want to make sure that we equip our mentors and the people leading sessions well. All right, we got about 3 minutes left. I'm sure many of you who are detail oriented like I am are probably still going to be writing a book of what you want to do. But I would love to go ahead and start generating some ideas of who might have pieces of it done. So who would be willing to be a brave volunteer and share kind of parts of what your tool that you created looked like? Yeah.
I chose emotion discovery.
Okay, emotion discovery.
The summary is emotions are expressed in a variety of ways. Example, words, actions, small or nonverbal communication. Feelings are how emotions are expressed in our bodies. Art and writing can help us express what we are feeling.
Okay, so an art tool.
Can we keep going?
Yeah.
And the location supplies are a horse inside or outside, paintbrush, water, sponge to clean off the horse, water and towel. And then the instructions and facilitation points. Choose 1 to 2 emotions and express the feeling from your heart. What is an emotion you identify with? What does happy or sad look like? And then paint it.
Nice. Yeah. So just so I can repeat that. So what's your name?
Melanie.
Melanie. Melanie chose to do an art tool with a horse, right? And her supplies were listed. She needed her art supplies. She needed a horse, right? And then her facilitation points that she gave the mentor to be able to understand that is that they needed to choose a few emotions, and then they're actually going to paint on the horse, right, what it looks like for that emotion for them, right? And so that's going to lead to a conversation, a deeper conversation, right? Melanie?
Is the skill emotion discovery, or is the skill actually painting?
That's a great question. So the skill is the thing that you want them to get from the tool, right? So our skill would be trust, boundaries, communication, or leadership. So your skill would be emotion discovery in your case, right? Yeah, so the skill itself is not painting, right? We're not ultimately teaching them how to paint, right? We want the skill to be like, what are we trying to get them to understand from this tool? So great question. Yeah. Anybody else want to share really quick?
My skill was responsiveness. So
Responsiveness.
You would utilize a horsemanship activity to illustrate or teach kids responsiveness.
Okay.
So you'd need a penned arena with a horse, and then the horse could choose 1 to 3 objects, such as like anything, like hula hoop, a cone of their choice, right? So you'd start off with a discussion. You'd ask, what is the response? You could practice it in conversation with a simple question like, what color is your hair? And then you would tell them what they did. So you teach them nonverbal.
Okay.
Oh, you looked at your hair. Then you looked at me and you said brown. That was response. And then you do kind of similar to with me, where you would approach the horse at the side and just notice the horse. What's the horse doing? And so you teach them horse language to that, and that's responsiveness.
Okay.
And then they could approach with a tool, like a hula hoop, or, so you can make it as long or as short as you want.
Yeah, I love that. So her skill was responsiveness, right? She needed a horse for it because she's utilizing a horsemanship tool to teach responsiveness. And what she's doing is, as she's having a conversation with her kid and asking questions like, what color is your hair? She's taking notice of what they do before they answer that question, right? So if they look at their hair or if they look at her, she's then going to call out to them the nonverbal cues that they gave, right? And so she's helping them understand what does it look like to be responsive and to give nonverbal cues. And then she's going to incorporate the horse. Well, how do I teach horse language, right? Great tool, right? Awesome. So, guys, I know that we are almost at time. We are at time. Any last minute burning questions from anybody?
I do. It's about trust. Okay, so you gotta understand that I'm a therapist. So
Okay.
I come from trauma.
Yes.
Like I do childhood trauma all the time, but I mostly work now with adults. I have worked with kids, but my adults that have childhood trauma, they could understand safety. They could go, oh, I'm safe, right? They've trained themselves rationally, but their brain has been impaired.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies on brain trauma. So their childhood brain is never safe. Ever, 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 ever.
Yeah.
So I love the parallel with the horses. The horses live in mistrust. That's their natural inclination. But how do you, you taught about trust as a core thing with a child, but I guess, do you approach it with the fact that you can never establish full trust with that child, or is that your goal? I mean, I know you can only to an extent in that period of time. Do you know what I'm saying? Or do you see trust as more layered? The only reason I ask is the therapist in me, it's hard to not want to map it out.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's great. So it's definitely layered, right?
Yeah.
As most things are. So yeah, I would say one thing that we talk about with our mentors is that we know with the amount of time that we're going to have our kids that we are a temporary secure attachment, right? And so as we are becoming that temporary secure attachment, we are at whatever level that kid is going to give us, right? We're meeting them where they're at. So we are meeting them where they're at, and we are developing the trust layer by layer, right?
And is your goal to bridge that from them into their environment?
Yeah. Our goal would be, right, that as they're building these skills of resiliency, they're building them in a safe environment and understanding what they look like on the ranch, so that then they can go off the ranch and learn, how do I determine when someone else is trustworthy,
Have you
right?
seen that happen where a kid learned it
Oh, yeah.
on the ranch and you've seen them
Yeah.
bridge that out?
Yeah. It's really cool not only to see it on the ranch within them coming full circle to our Kids Give Back program, right? But also to have them come back to us and tell us stories of like, I did this, right? Or maybe sometimes they don't even recognize it, but they tell us a story of how we saw them display it, and we get to say back to them like, oh my goodness, you just did it, right? You helped like someone else learn what it looks like to trust, or you learned what it looked like to deem someone trustworthy or not, right?
Are you able to do that without bridging with other adults in their lives? Because you're talking about kids here.
Yeah.
Or are other adults part of that bridge?
Do you mean like other adult, like
caregivers, teachers, therapists, social workers?
Yeah. So I would say on our ranch, like the connection that we have most, right, is the caregiver who's bringing them, right? And so as much as possible, as they're willing to share within a session, we do help bridge through some of our tools like trust circles and determining how much they trust other people in their life already, right? We do help bridge like, well, how can you develop trust with that person more, right? Okay. So as much as they're willing to share within a session.
But that's just you as a child.
That's right.
When I say bridge, I mean like, you know what I mean, the communicating with the parent.
Yeah. So we definitely like have communication like with the parent, but we like to be able to keep the session with confidential between the mentor and the kid, and then bridge to the parent when we need to. Yeah, great question.
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. You guys rock. Yeah. Awesome. And guys, the last thing I do want to share is if you have not heard about this today, we are wanting you to just have the opportunity to understand more about what we are doing at Hope Reins. One of the things that we are developing is Headquarters of Hope. We have our director with us, Josh Northington. Headquarters of Hope is really our academy that we're designing to help people on all different walks of this similar ministry journey to be able to understand, like, how do we do what we do, right? And so we have an essentials training that's going to be all online, 22 videos, and we would love for you guys to learn more about it. So if you want to learn more about our Headquarters of Hope and what that looks like to understand the business and leadership and operations of starting or continuing to grow an organization, then we would love for you guys to be able to check out Headquarters of Hope. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. You did a great job.